Night gathers at the edge of the fields, and the sand, which holds the day's heat, exhales into the dark. A jackal slips from the limestone ridge above Saqqara, its paws silent on a path that men cut toward an early royal tomb. A doorway waits, carved and squared, the mouth of the earth held open by stone, and a guardian, whose name will become a prayer, learns where to stand. In the low light of Memphis, a city that looks east to the sunrise, the west rises as a different country. The desert escarpment, which breaks where the floodplain ends, forms a long wall of dry caves and cut shafts. Here, in the 3rd dynasty, around the time of Djoser's step pyramid, masons turned sand into architecture, and a landscape of mastabas lines the horizon. The bodies they hide are no longer touched by wind or the burning sun, which once dried the flesh in shallow graves. The miracle of preservation, which the open desert once gave, now needs a craft, a place, and a patron god. At Giza, during the 4th dynasty, the plateau shows the same logic in stone, and at Abydos, in the low desert beyond the cultivated fields, the same logic takes root. The dead move inward from the surface, into chambers that fold back like a clenched hand, and the world of rot, which the sand once thwarted, presses in. A solution will arrive, not only in oils, linens, and natron, but in order, language, and oath. The figure who comes to hold that order wears the long muzzle of a jackal, and his epithets mark the ground he guards. He is tA-dsr, Lord of the Sacred Land being the necropolis itself, a legal zone of purity and danger. He is he who is upon his mountain, the mountain being the ridge that blocks the western sky, a watch post above the doors of the dead. He is jmy-wt, he who is in the place of embalming, the room where fluids are drained, and the body, which has lost its desert, is given a new one in cloth. On the western edge of settlements, jackals keep a steady corridor between rubbish heaps and the first rise of the desert. Anyone who tends cattle in the outskirts hears them at night, a high call that threads the distance. The Egyptians, who know the habits of animals as part of the same land calendar that governs irrigation, pay attention to where those tracks run. The tracks cross offerings left at small grave mounds in the predynastic period. They cross stone thresholds loaded with bread and beer in the early dynastic age. They circle criminal pits where thieves have been buried, and patrolmen have little power. The jackal is neither tame nor purely hostile, and its image fits a boundary post that needs sight, smell, and patience. When artisans paint the jackal on a standard at Abydos, they mark a function that begins at the edge of the village, then steps into ritual. Abydos, where the royal tombs of the 1st dynasties lie at el-Kab, teaches a second lesson. Processions move from the town out to the desert, with standards before them, and a canine god appears as an opener of the way. Wepwawet, whose name means opener of the ways, leads the route, and his standard shows a wolfish form above a pole. He is a scout, a guide, a forward path for kings and armies, and an old title at Asyut in Middle Egypt keeps his memory. Anubis, who will later guide too, does not begin as a duplicate. His title points down, not forward. He claims the land of burial, the booth of embalmers, the ridgeline that looks back over the graves. When funerary liturgies from the Old Kingdom invoke he who is upon his mountain, they ask the jackal to stand above a tomb, not to run before a march. In the pyramid texts carved in the inner chambers at Saqqara during the 5th and 6th dynasties, the dead king is addressed by Anubis with the formality of court and with the care of a craftsman. The texts call him who is before the divine booth and who is in the place of embalming, and in those phrases a space is fixed. A booth is set up, a frame with linen walls, a good house, the pernefer, and inside that house, a corpse becomes a body again. The king is told to sit up, to eat bread, to receive his mouth, which must open to speak. Every verb is a tool, and each tool needs a keeper. The keeper is the jackal lord of the necropolis, who accepts the authority to touch a face that should not be touched by hands. Giza shows a similar legal tone, even in private tombs. False doors cut into chapel walls receive offerings, and above them, short spells promise passage for a name, not for a thief. The more the necropolis grows, the greater the need for a god who polices not only crime, but also mistake. The desert is sacred because rituals done wrongly can ruin a body as thoroughly as a pilfered jewelry cache. In that world, law is not a court with penalties. It is a geometry of gestures, oils, and words that must align. Anubis occupies that geometry, and when priests act, they do so with his mask over their faces. A priest in linen, his head covered with a long snout mask, leans over a bier in a private chapel near the causeway of Unas. The travelers who come with bread and beer stand quiet in the doorway because the moment is exacting. The body on the bier has been washed and anointed, and the ribs are wrapped in fresh cloth. The priest lifts a paseshkef, a fish-shaped tool remembered from birth rituals, and a metal adze with a wooden handle. The opening of the mouth begins, and the words that accompany the taps and sweeps claim to unlock breath, sight, smell, and voice. The action does not resurrect, it legalizes. It affirms that a person still counts where his name is written. Anubis, invoked at the threshold of each motion, binds the living hand to the lawful right to touch the dead. The logic of mummification rises from this same pair of sources, craft and jurisdiction. At first, in the late predynastic and early Old Kingdom, the natural desiccation of sand does much of the work. When burials move into cut chambers, the elements no longer help, and the body fails in the dark. By the Old Kingdom, oils and resins slow decay, and linen binds limbs into a shape that can be recognized and held. By the Middle Kingdom, the craft grows more consistent, and the embalmer's place, the jmy-wt, adds ritual weight to clean techniques. Natron, a mineral salt collected from dry lakes, becomes the main agent of drying, and the body's water, which once left in the heat of the open desert, is now drawn out under supervision. The embalmer's oath preserves not only a corpse, but a contract, and Anubis is the witness, whose eyes are painted on every wall that matters. On a slab near the entrance to a 6th dynasty tomb at Saqqara, a jackal lies atop a standard, and beneath it a single line of text reads tA-dsr. The title binds the animal to place. The sacred land is not an abstract heaven, it is the visible ridge, the cut shafts, the stored jars of oils, and the small chapels with bread loaves carved in stone. In truth, the epithet calls for order against deep fear. Hyenas prowl, servants can be bribed, famine can tempt a thin man to rob a grave. The god who stands here must be terrible enough to deter and patient enough to watch. At Abydos, the question of who owns the West becomes a competition of titles. Foremost of the Westerners, a phrase that will migrate to Osiris, appears early as a jackal standard and a funerary form. Scholars argue about whether this title first belonged to Wepwawet or to a local jackal god who later merged into Osiris, but in either case, Anubis holds to his narrower, sharper portfolio. He never leaves the body or the place where the body is handled. When Osiris rises, people debate theology in hymns and inscriptions, but the craft room still calls Anubis by his old names, and the priest reaches for the same mask. Middle Kingdom coffins from Asyut and Thebes preserve this continuity. Coffin texts inscribed in neat black and red ink ask Anubis to stretch his hand over the deceased, to protect limbs, to make the wrapping strong. The spell numbers differ by collection. The variations show local schools, yet the image remains steady. The jackal sits atop a shrine. The tail curls forward, the ears stand high, and the gaze falls on the door latch. In painted scenes, the god rests on a chest, which holds bandages, resin, and amulets, and the caption repeats jmy-wt, as if the word itself seals the linen. The city of the living, which controls the workshops that serve the necropolis, adds another function to the jackal's brief. Processions must travel exposed corridors, and grief, which grows loud in a crowd, needs a figure to frame it. During ceremonies, a masked priest as Anubis moves at the head or at the flank of the bier, and his presence shapes the mood from raw shock to polished rite. In Old Kingdom scenes, he stands beside tables of knives, jars, and cloth strips, and in Middle Kingdom papyri, he touches the face with an adze that glints with rules. Jackals still patrol the edges. Herders near Giza detect their prints at dawn, near the small wadi where a side path runs up toward the quarry. In the dry riverbeds, a man can disappear from view, and a body can be laid down in silence. The society that invents a master of the sacred land does not pretend that danger ends with law. It places law into an animal that understands the hour when scavengers wake and grant that animal speech, names, and a mouth that can command other mouths to stop. The opening of the mouth returns because threshold rites are the spine of this world. A closed mouth is the sign of a place where words cannot work. A mouth that opens under formula can drink and can answer when called by a name. The priest, who speaks as Anubis, sometimes as a son, sometimes as a craftsman, makes a face into a legal surface, then withdraws. The tA-dsr taps the lips, touches the eyes, and moves to the nose and ear in an orderly pass. The scene repeats from the Old Kingdom into the New, with more instruments in later periods, but the form does not lose its core. The jackal god, who owns the booth, remains the patron of that quick alignment of tool and syllable. At Giza, the social fact of spectacle grows large. Massive causeways link valley temples to pyramid bases, and funerary complexes multiply rooms where officials stand, count offerings, and watch the choreography of rites. Anubis appears on lintels, on bed frames, on small amulets carved in stone, and on canopic chests, whose exact use will evolve in later centuries. Even where Osiris is absent, the jackal marks a perimeter. His presence signals a curb, a reopening of control, when a process risks collapse. In Memphis, the embalmers' quarters occupy clean rooms near water, not for washing only, but also for mixing pastes and resins. Cedar oil, imported by ship, sits in jars in cool shade, and conifer resins, scraped from trees in far hills, thicken in bowls that smell sweet and sharp. Linens, woven in workshops that serve temples, arrive in bolts with a known width and a known price, so that the family of the dead can reckon the cost. The labor fits the economy of the living, and the god who rules the place of embalming stands as the witness to fair measure. The scales that we will later see in judgment belong here first, to the craft, to counting jars, bandages, and time. A single mask survives in a museum case, black wood polished smooth, the snout long, the teeth invisible, the eyes painted with white rims. It is likely a priest's mask worn over the head during rites. The smell of the resin that once soaked the bandages it watched has long since gone, but the posture remains. The gaze dips toward a horizontal plane, as if watching the line of a mouth or the rim of a chest. The room label reads, Anubis mask, late period, and yet the shape reaches back to the Old Kingdom booth. The line between a god and a man in a mask blurs, because ritual always borrows the body that is closest at hand. Abydos again, with its long history of royal memory and its pilgrim traffic in the Middle Kingdom. Stelae of ordinary people line a processional path, their inscriptions asking the local god to remember their names. Some stelae show Anubis upon a shrine, and the caption repeats, Lord of the Sacred Land. The townspeople, who leave bread at these stones, know that a shrine image does not move, yet they trust that the gaze of the god runs along the edge of the desert ridge and drops back into the town if a cry crosses the boundary. The god's jurisdiction crosses no river and breaks no door, yet it binds doors from the inside. In provincial necropolis beyond Memphis and Thebes, the same system holds in smaller rooms. At Beni Hassan, at Mir, at El Bersha, nomarchs and their families use local artisans who copy scenes from wider centers and adjust the titles. Anubis is always present where bandaging or final touch occurs, usually at the left, often perched on a shrine or attending a bier. The captions are brief, the orthography shifts with time, but the function remains. A guardian joins craft to rule. The desert itself supplies language. The west is the place of setting, where the sun dives each evening. The word for Westerners, those who dwell with the setting sun, becomes a word for the dead. A ridge, which in Arabic and Coptic would later be called by practical names, is in the Old Kingdom a legal boundary that produces titles. He who is upon his mountain is not poetic hyperbole. It is an address to a real ridge where real jackals sit, in the hours when the city sleeps. This is why the image endures. It is true first as a map, then as a theology. By the Middle Kingdom, when Thebes rises and dynastic power shifts south, Anubis keeps his functions with few losses. Coffins from Deir el-Bersha repeat the old phrases, and additional spells for protection name him plainly. A man from the 12th dynasty, wrapped and laid into a rock-cut tomb, receives the same opening of the mouth, though the tools are now more numerous and the rubrics more elaborate. The booth, the per-nefer, remains a pure place. The Wepwawet within the complex remains fenced by rules, and jmy-wt still points to a room where a knife and a word are timed to the same beat. When we look back to Giza and Saqqara from these later chambers, we see how a guardian grew with the stone. The earliest ground burials leaned on the desert to do the drying, and the jackal watched from a distance. Stone takes that function from nature and gives it to men, and then men give it back to a god through rite. Anubis becomes the hinge that lets a new kind of burial open and close without tearing the social fabric. He prevents wrong hands from touching, and he authorizes right hands to do the dangerous touch without sin. A worker in the 4th dynasty cuts a slot for a doorbolt in a chapel. He looks up the slope and sees a jackal, narrow and still, silhouetted against the pale sky. He makes a joke to his friend about the god who inspects masons, then he keeps cutting. The smile works because both men accept the image as a fact of the landscape. By the time the pyramid texts are incised for Unas and Teti, that joke has become law. The wearer of the mask will stand by the bolt the worker cut, and will grant or withhold permission for a living hand to touch the still mouth. In private stelae, from the Old Kingdom at Giza, A bread loaf rests on a table before a seated figure, and beneath the table, a dog often sits. The dog is not Anubis, but the eye finds the link. Animals that guard the house sit under chairs. Animals that guard the threshold sit on shrines. The jackal becomes the shrine guardian, and his names create a grammar for how thresholds work. The per-nefer is a room. The Wepwawet is a pure zone inside it. jmy-wt is the place name in the register of gods, and tA-dsr is the title that holds the ridge while the rites unfold. The palette of resins, which will grow more complex later, begins with cedar and conifer, with castor oil, with plant gums from the Nile Valley and beyond. The smell is medicinal and sweet, and the touch leaves a shine on linen. The craft takes pride in this controlled gleam, and tomb scenes fix it with the same care they give to cut meat and jars of beer. When Anubis watches, he does not watch from heaven, he watches from an arm's length, where light falls across a wrapped chest, and a mouth waits for its tool. Arguments about titles at Abydos never change the quiet facts. Wepwawet opens the way for the procession, and military hymns later remember his speed. Anubis stays with the body, and the booth makes him necessary. Old hymns to the king call on Anubis to dress him, to bind limbs, to make a path through mountains of the west. But even then, the path is a mortuary track, not a campaign road. The two gods are cousins who took different roads at a fork near the town's last house. In the rooms where natron will later dry the body for weeks, the earlier practice is shorter, yet the logic is the same. Separation from the living is a step, and washing is a step, and binding is a step, and speech seals each step with a name. Names matter because they give the dead a face that the living can call. The opening of the mouth completes that circuit. Without speech, a name floats. Without speech, a person cannot answer when a god calls from a gate. The image of the jackal lying upon a shrine, familiar from countless coffins and papyri, brings the argument home. The shrine is a box that holds tools, bandages, and amulets. The animal lies across that box, not in casual sleep, but as a lock. His forepaws hang over the lid, his ears rise like spears, and the tail curves forward as if to bind the back edge. Even in small scale, the posture is legal. It says that the equipment of the dead belongs to those with right words, at the right hour, in the right place. At Saqqara, the long causeway of Unis leads from a valley temple, where water meets stone, up to the pyramid, where the desert claims the final ground. A family follows a bier along that way, and behind them servants carry jars and bolts of linen. In the temple at the top, a priest in a jackal mask waits by a low table. He will speak as Anubis, and his voice will make a path that no soldier could clear. The mouth of the tomb will open to receive, then close to protect, and the guardian will take his place upon the mountain again. Light fades across the ridge, and the same jackal steps back into silhouette. The workers have gone, the jars have been sealed, and the chapel incense thins in the air. A doorstone slides, and the click of the bolt sounds final in the throat. For a moment, the world is only the scrape of sand, and the thought that law must continue after silence. Inside, the bandaged face has been touched, the words have been spoken, and the mouth is ready. The door settles, the last sliver of light vanishes, and in the dark beyond the threshold, the first invisible scale, which belongs to craft before it belongs to judgment, begins to stir. A door closes on stone, and inside, the air thickens with resin and salt. In the per-nefer, the good house of Memphis, a bier stands on wooden blocks, and the first hour begins to count. The men inside move with clean hands, their heads shaved, their linen white, and the jackal mask, which leans on a peg against the wall, watches as if it owned the room. In the embalmer's quarter near the river, jars line a bench, each sealed with clay impressed by a temple ring. The labels name cedar and juniper and plant gum, and oil that came by boat from the Levant, and natron from the dry basins west of the delta. In the Wadi Natron, salt curls like frost across empty flats, and men dig it with wicker scoops, then carry it east to the house of purity, the Wepwawet, where the dead wait on wooden slats. The smell is sharp, clean, and slightly sweet, and it clings to the fingers of the priest, who will soon take up the mask of Anubis. On the first day, the body is received, its hair cut close, its skin washed with palm wine and water from a sacred pool. The embalmers have a charter from the temple, and the presence of the jackal god makes their work a kind of law. In some rooms, a slender bronze hook rests beside a bowl, ready for the delicate motion that empties the skull through the nose. Herodotus, who traveled in the 5th century BCE, describes this motion with the detached voice of a reporter and adds that other families choose gentler methods or cheaper ones when the purse is thin. The Egyptians themselves leave fewer open descriptions of the cut and more hymns to the order that frames it, since the knife alone is only a tool, and a tool without a god does not make a safe passage. On the 15th day, when the natron has drawn water from the tissues, a boy lifts a lid from a jar and the smell of cedar escapes into the heat. The inner cavities, empty of their organs, receive resins, oils, and linen pads. The hands of the workers move as if counting, since each motion belongs to a tally, and the tally belongs to a god. Anubis is present as a statue on a small shrine, its black snout pointed toward the bier, its ears tall, its tail curved along the box top. The title on the shrine reads jmy-wt, meaning in the place of embalming, and the title on the wall reads tA-dsr, Lord of the Sacred Land, reminding everyone that the room sits under the same law as the ridge. Lord of the Sacred Land, which reminds everyone that the room sits under the same law as the ridge. In the light that falls through a high lattice, strips of linen hang like pale river weeds, each soaked in resin and pressed smooth by a flat stone. At Thebes, in workrooms above the floodplain, the same ritual order governs, though the accents of the team differ, and the local priest speaks with a southern cadence. From Elephantine to the Fayum, the craft repeats itself with regional confidence, and the jackal god appears on box lids, on knives, and on the threshold of the door, which bears a black guard line that no unclean foot may cross. On a second bench, small chests wait, each with 4 cavities cut square, and each cavity lined with a glaze that shines in lamplight. The organs taken from the body do not vanish. They move under new guardians, and the chest itself becomes a little map of the corpse. The lids of the cavity jars show 4 heads, a human, a baboon, a jackal, a falcon, which the scribes name in paint. Imseti takes the liver, Hapi the lungs, Duamutef the stomach, Kebe-Sinuef the intestines, and a priest recites the names as if he were settling boundary stones. Protective goddesses stand close in the texts, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket, and the chest, which looks like furniture, turns into a protected court inside the tomb. In many burials of the New Kingdom, a canopic chest stands near the foot of the coffin, and its presence changes how the family reads the room. They see a geography, with the body in the center, and the chest at one side, and the offerings laid along the other, and the jackal upon a shrine beside the bier. In later centuries, when custom changes and some embalmers return the organs to the body, The chest remains, sometimes as dummy jars, and the guardians remain too, since once a door has a posted watchman, no one wants to take him down. On the 30th day, when wrappings have begun to rise thick along the limbs, a heart scarab sits on the bench, its back carved with neat signs. The stone is often green, a hard serpentine or a polished jasper, and the scarab's underside bears a plea that belongs to a specific spell. Chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead asks the heart, which remembers in Egyptian thought, not to stand against the person in judgment. The line, which many of us could recite even from a museum label, speaks to the organ as a friend with too good a memory. O my heart, which I had from my mother, do not stand up as witness against me. Do not oppose me before the tribunal. The scarab will be tied over the heart with cords, and its text will talk back when fear thickens at the gate. In a small room at Deir el-Medina, where artisans who decorate royal tombs live between the cliffs and the fields, a scribe copies a vignette with careful hands. He draws a balance, 2 pans suspended from a beam, and on the left pan he paints a small red heart. On the right he draws a feather, the sign of Ma'at, whose law binds gods and men, and whose single plume looms larger than a palace in the mind. Ibis-headed Thoth stands near, a palette under his arm, and behind him a line of assessors sits with faces that look out from the page into the reader. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the embalming booth, adjusts the plum with one hand, and the other hand holds the cord that steadies the beam. The scribe adds a caption in black and red, weighing the heart, and writes the owner's name in the position of the justified. The papyrus of Hunefer, which rests today in the British Museum, preserves this scene with such order that the lines seem to speak. Hunefer and his wife bow before a tribunal where Osiris sits enthroned, and behind the throne Isis and Nephthys stand as sisters who have watched death before. The balance sits in the center, and the jackal hand corrects the tilt with a touch that looks more like a rule than a rescue. Thoth records the outcome in a neat column, and at his feet, the creature Ammit waits, her head of a crocodile, her forequarters of a lion, her hindquarters of a hippopotamus, an eater of the weight that refuses the law. In truth, this is not a horror scene, it is a bookkeeping scene, and the presence of Anubis links the arithmetic of judgment to the arithmetic of the workshop. At Memphis, a priest prepares the same balance as a tool of craft, not of quartz. Scales measure natron by weight, linens by the roll, oils by the jar, and time by an agreed sequence of visits. When Anubis moves from the bench to the tribunal, he does not change identity, he changes jurisdiction, and the feather that settles on the other pan is the same idea that kept a blade clean. Ma'at is not a feeling, Ma'at is the habit of correct measure, and the jackal is the hand that knows how to set the beam level. When the body has been dried and filled, the long wrapping begins, a practice which creates a new surface for names and images. The wrappings rise in layers, and artisans place small amulets at critical joints, a djed pillar to strengthen the spine, a tight knot to call Isis, an eye to keep watch. Each tie becomes a sentence in a text written in cloth, and when the mask is laid over the face, the message gains a voice. In the New Kingdom, gold leaf sometimes covers a cartonnage mask, and the painted pupils look as if they could focus on the crooked line in the plaster above. Anubis sits nearby on his shrine, and a human priest, who wears his head, lifts the paseshkef to begin the last pass of the opening of the mouth. At this moment, the rites converge. The mouth, which will speak in the halls of judgment, needs a tool to wake it, and the body, which will lie in the tomb for centuries, needs a seal to protect it. Anubis, invoked as he who is upon his mountain, looks down from the ridge in speech, and as he who is in the place of embalming, he looks across the bench with a hand. The tA-dsr touches the lips, and the linen tightens at the neck, and the craft becomes a theology that breathes through masks and through the clean edge of a blade. The procession that follows the wrapping brings Anubis into the open air again. At Saqqara, at Giza, at Thebes, the bier leaves the house of purity under a canopy, and the mourners move at a measured pace along a road known to their grandparents by the same turns. The masked priest walks ahead or to the side, and his profile, long and exact, reads the horizon for signs. Women wail in a pattern that repeats a known pattern, and men carry jars and bolts of linen for the final chamber. When the bier arrives at the door cut into the desert's tooth, the mask turns inward, and the last words before the closing belong to a god who understands doors. In the inner room, a canopic chest takes its corner, the coffin takes its bed, and offerings, which the family will replenish on feast days, stand on a painted table. Scenes on the walls show the judgments to come, which for the new theology are open to more people than before. In the Old Kingdom, the pyramid texts lift kings into a sky of imperishable stars, and only the ruler walks with gods. In the Middle Kingdom, the coffin texts bring spells to high officials and to those who buy space for words, and the horizon cracks open a little. In the New Kingdom, papyri we call the Book of the Dead circulate widely, and chapter after chapter turns the dead into legal persons with rights and with scripts for gates. The god who suits this widening of access is Osiris, a murdered king who returned as judge and ruler of the Western realm, and whose story speaks to the hope that a torn body can be made whole. In temple myths told at Abydos and on later papyri, the body of Osiris lies scattered by his brother, and Isis gathers the pieces, with a patience that looks like the work of embalmers. Anubis, in these accounts, assists the reassembly and fashions the first embalming for a god. Some traditions call him the son of Nephthys and Osiris, hidden by fear from the anger of Seth and sheltered by jackals on the edge of the fields. Other traditions leave his parentage ambiguous, but all agree that his hands belong to the craft that made Osiris whole. From that moment forward, the language of mummification becomes proof of a myth, and the myth becomes a template for every private burial that follows. As the Osiris cult rises in the Middle Kingdom and in the New, the seat of judgment shifts from a royal sky to a Western court where Osiris presides. The weighing of the heart scene becomes a center panel for private hopes, and the presence of Anubis in that panel binds the court to the workshop. He adjusts the scale, he presents the justified before the throne, he stands beside the coffin in painted chapels, and he lies upon the shrine above the canopic chest. If Osiris is the judge, Anubis is the bailiff, the conservator, and the first hand on the door. At Abydos, festivals reenact the search for the god's body, and processions carry a boat with a hidden shrine across the desert. The people who watch from the low dunes see both myths at once, the hunt for a lost king, and the ordinary movement of a wrapped friend into the west. Anubis appears in hymns that call for protection of limbs and for the purity of bandages, and Osiris appears in hymns that call for the vindication of the name. In the interplay, a person finds comfort that the body will be safe from teeth and damp, and that the voice, when it speaks in the hall of Ma'at, will not betray itself. The scarf of the Nile binds this cosmology to seasons. Fields rise green in the flood and dry to stubble under the sun, and in the west, the ridge holds its line against the wind. The embalmers work when floodwater falls and air clears, and the canopic chests are carried up causeways while cranes call from marshes. In Thebes, the Valley of the Kings belongs to Osiris by story, but the secret tomb doors still answer to the jackal's gaze. On painted coffins from the 18th dynasty, Anubis bends over a mummy on a bed shaped like a lion, and the caption uses the old titles without apology because a courtroom needs a bench, and a bench still needs a keeper. Near the close of the New Kingdom, when tomb robbery trials are recorded on papyri, like the Abbott and Amherst papyri, the terror of violation speaks bluntly. Officials describe broken seals, scattered bandages, and missing amulets, and they punish men who treated the West as a storehouse. The persistence of Anubis across these grim pages is not a failure. It is a reminder that guardianship is an ongoing labor. Law must be enforced by living hands, and the mask must still go on a living face if the door is to hold. The people who copy the trials also copy hymns to Anubis, and in their parallel work, the two modes of protection, human and divine, remain braided. In the workrooms that serve the priesthood at Karnak and Luxor, new amulets appear in molds, and new formulas for resin mixtures rise in notebooks. The scent of pine and incense thickens under cedar rafters, and the black wood mask receives a fresh polish with oil. The priests who wear the mask teach apprentices how to time the opening of the mouth and how to hold the adzé without scraping the painted lips. The body is now swaddled in hundreds of strips, the heart scarab tied with a firm knot, the canopic chest set true against the wall. The room, which looked like a place for medicine when the body first arrived, looks now like a courtroom in miniature, and the jackal on the shrine looks like the hinge between the two. When a papyrus painter in Thebes copies the judgment scene for a new owner, he places Anubis at the scale with unwavering certainty. The tribunal shifts in size across the centuries, the style shifts in line thickness, the garments change in pattern, yet the jackal hand still holds the plum. In Roman glass, later, the feather will be etched with a new finesse, and Greek captions will creep toward the margins, yet the posture remains. The dead still need a guardian who knows both rooms, the silent house of preparation and the loud hall of verdicts. At Memphis, at a late hour, the priest removes the mask and wipes the inside with a cloth that smells of resin. He places the head gently on its peg and covers it with a linen veil. Out in the street, a child points at a jackal on the ridge, and his mother tells him the name with ordinary certainty. In that small exchange, a theology finds its home in the mouth of the living, and the God, who holds doors for the wordless, receives his daily tribute in a child's breath. On the day of burial, the bier reaches the door cut into the desert, and the last offerings are placed. The priest, who bears the adzé, performs the final syllables of the opening of the mouth, and the family withdraws to the threshold. The coffin slides into its stone bed, the canopic chest is set square against the south wall, the heart scarab rests in the lined cavity of the chest, and the painted feather shines against the judgment scene at eye height. Anubis, on the wall and in the titles, holds his station between body and name. The doorstone moves, the last ray of sun passes across the jackal's painted nose, and the bolt sounds once, and then not again. In the dark, silence gathers, and the logic of the craft becomes a promise. The body will not draw flies, the bandages will not weep. The organs will remain under guardians, and the mouth, which tasted resin, will answer when called. The tribunal is far off in mythic space, and yet, in truth, the two rooms touch. The scale that weighed linen and salt becomes the scale that weighs words and acts, and Anubis, who watched the counting hands, now watches the tilt against a feather. On a coast far to the north, ships unload amphorae at Naucratis, and Greek speech mingles with Egyptian in the market. In Alexandria, after the conquest, marble steps rise where mud bricks stood, and scholars collect papyri in halls open to the sea wind. The jackal standard still stands on shrines inland, yet a new pronunciation begins to share his name, and a fused title passes from mouth to mouth along the quays. Anubis, the sailors say, and the sound reaches the desert like a gust that carries salt into the wadi. In the next room of the story, which opens with foreign stone and local incense, the same guardian will be asked to keep his watch beneath a new sky. Sea wind moves through colonnades of fresh stone, and on the quay at Alexandria, Greek and Egyptian speech mix above jars and bales. In the Serapeum quarter, where Isis has a temple with painted walls, a new title appears in the mouths of sailors. Anubis, they say, and the name steps into port with the same authority that once watched a carved door at Saqqara. In the streets off the harbor, small shrines hold bronze figures with a jackal head and a human body, and the fusion, which looks like a novelty, holds an old function, since a guardian still needs feet that can walk among men. At Rome, in a garden off the Tiber, a marble statue shows the same blend, a man in Greek dress with a jackal head, and a caduceus held as if to mark a road. The galleries that will one day become the Vatican museums house such figures, which stand as proof of how a cult crosses languages. Plutarch, who writes in Greek in the 1st century, speaks of Anubis in his book on Isis and Osiris and calls him a kind of guard dog, which is not a belittling, but a careful comparison to a creature that hears danger before men do. The tone of that Roman voice is tidy, even skeptical, yet the need that made the jackal head still comes from a doorway cut into dry stone. Along the Nile, which still judges the seasons with its flood, the older forms remain. At Deir el-Bahri, in the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, a chapel is dedicated to Anubis, and its painted reliefs show the god standing tall in a hall that opens to the cliff. The chapel walls, which hold color in shaded recesses, set the jackal head against processions of offerings, and the captions use the old epithets without apology. At nearby Karnak, where Ptolemaic kings add new courts to older complexes, inscriptions continue to list priests of Anubis, and the title jmy-wt in the Place of Embalming remains a living office. At Saqqara, near the Serapeum Road, a temple to Anubis rises in the late period, and beneath it catacombs stretch in darkness. The Anubian, as scholars call it, holds the mummies of dogs, wrapped and laid in galleries like an army of watchful shapes, and the votive traffic that feeds the catacombs proves how a guardian god can be thanked with the body of his own animal. The practice is new in scale and late in date, yet the logic is old, since a person seeks protection by strengthening the eye that watches the door. The jackal, which once sat above a shrine as a sign, now fills whole corridors with bandaged forms, and the pilgrims from Memphis bring oil lamps to light the way. In the Valley of the Kings, where the tomb of Tutankhamun lay sealed until 1922, a black jackal rests on a golden shrine with carrying poles. When Howard Carter and his team opened the chamber, the recumbent figure lay with its ears erect over a chest that held precious equipment of the dead, and a wreath of flowers, now dust, had once encircled the neck. The jackal's eyes were of obsidian and calcite, and the shellac that made the wood shine still caught the light of a torch. That shrine, now in Cairo, holds a lesson like the one we saw in small pictures, since the posture is still a lock, and the title NB tA-dsr, Lord of the Sacred Land, still fits a figure that can bar a lid with the weight of a gaze. On Roman period mummy cartonnage from the Fayum, gilded masks show a face made into a godlike image, and along the sides, painted scenes still give Anubis his station. Sometimes he stands behind a bier, sometimes he adjusts a balance, and the caption beneath his feet repeats the titles learned in Saqqara and Thebes. Even when Greek letters share the space with hieroglyphs, the grammar of the image remains, which tells us that a new language does not erase a profession. Anubis remains a custodian for the risky touch at the threshold. At Edfu, a temple dedicated to Horus rises with Ptolemaic precision, and on its outer walls complex processions show priests in masks carrying images of gods. Anubis appears in these scenes as an escort and a purifier, and the captions link him to purification rites with water and incense. At Dendera, where Hathor's temple holds a grand hypostyle hall, reliefs show embalmers' rituals in symbolic form, and the jackal shares panels with Wepwawet, who still opens roads in the mind of the scribe. At Hybes, a temple in the Karga oasis finished in the 5th century BCE, wall scenes show Anubis among the guardians of gates, which tells us that even under Persian rule, the old custodian kept his rounds of thresholds. In the rooms where embalmers still work in the Ptolemaic age, recipes thicken. The mixtures of resin and oil grow more layered. The number of amulets increases, and the wrappings build a surface that can carry more text. The heart scarab remains at the center, with Book of the Dead chapter 30b carved in lines that new hands have copied for generations. The canopic practice changes under fashion, sometimes returning organs to the body under bandages, sometimes keeping dummy jars for the sake of tradition. Yet the Four Sons of Horus keep their names, and their heads still look out from chests with a gaze like a watch. Processions in this late period swell with display. Priests of Anubis wear black varnished masks with long snouts, and in their hands they carry adzes and incense burners, which make a field of scent around the bier. The Sem priest, in a leopard skin, still recites the opening of the mouth in the center of the rite, and the lector priest, the high heb, reads from rolls in a voice trained to keep syllables exact. The hierarchy of rolls, which took shape in the Old Kingdom, remains legible on the street, and people at the edge of the crowd call out the old titles with certainty. On coins and engraved gems of the Roman period, a human figure with a jackal head sometimes holds a caduceus and a palm, and the Greek legend reads Hermanubis. In Oxyrhynchus, where rubbish heaps have preserved papyri for modern scholars, Greek prayers and business notes mention offerings to the same fused deity, and in Alexandria, inscriptions in Greek and Demotic mingle on small altars. The fusion does not replace Anubis in the tomb, it adds a civic face for the same talent, a way to call a guardian into a port city where people die far from their ancestral doors. The ordinary tools of the craft keep their weight. Wooden headrests, which hold the neck of a wrapped person, stand beside coffins in Roman period burials, and small faience amulets in the shape of a jackal lie under bandages near the shoulder. The false doors in private chapels, which once took offerings in Old Kingdom mastabas, have cousins in painted doorways on later coffins, and Anubis appears beside those paintings with a hand extended as if to accept a measure. The world inside a tomb remains a house, and the god who guards the place of embalming remains the doorkeeper of that house. In the deserts beyond the cultivated land, old centers hold their lines. Abydos still draws processions that dramatize the body of Osiris, and the shepherds who watch from a ridge hear the same mix of wails and hymns that their ancestors heard. Anubis appears as a helper in those myths, which knit the craft to a god who overcame a violent death, and the sense that a private burial imitates a divine restoration remains a comfort across centuries. When Greek writers describe these festivals, they bring a texture of outsiders' eyes, and their words, which sometimes skip over details, still transmit the shape of a guardian walking about a shrine. In legal records of tomb robberies from the 20th dynasty, the blunt prose of accusation and confession mentions doors, seals, and broken wrappings. Those pages, which read like dark reports from night patrols, keep the human part of guardianship in focus. A mask cannot arrest a thief, yet the presence of Anubis on walls and chests reminds the living that they act within a net of law. In the late period, when the Anubian dog catacombs received their streams of votive bodies, the impulse to secure help from the god grows practical and heartfelt, and the lamps that burn in those tunnels cast light, like dotted lines on the curve of a vault. In workshops that serve temples under Ptolemy and under Rome, new styles of cartonnage cover mummy heads with bright paint, and the faces become firm, calm profiles. Some masks have gilt that catches lamplight, and some have glass paste inlays that shine like eyes under shallow shadow. On the sides of many of these masks, Anubis bends over a mummy on a lion bed, and the careful painter gives the jackal head a crisp outline against a yellow field. The scene is small, yet it holds the entire argument, because the guardian, who bends from the booth, still knows how to keep a door that does not swing. In Pompeii, where a temple of Isis stands near the theater, frescoes in Egyptian style share walls with Latin notices for plays. After the eruption, ash fixes the moment, and centuries later, excavators find small bronzes, among them figures of a jackal-headed god that likely came from Egypt. A sailor who left Alexandria could have carried such a figure in a sea chest and placed it near a threshold in a rented room. The survival of such pieces, now in Naples and in Rome, shows the way a domestic shrine carries a guardian into places far from a desert ridge. When modern excavators read the papyrus of Hunefer in London or stand before the Anubis shrine of Tutankhamun in Cairo, they witness not a dead faith, but a working diagram of boundary care. The balance, which carries a feather and a heart, looks like a perfect emblem of a moral code, yet in truth, it also looks like the scale that once sat on a bench beside natron and resin. The connection across rooms keeps appearing. The judgment hall is an echo of a workshop, and Anubis is the echo's first voice. Across the long arc from the Old Kingdom to the Roman age, the place of Anubis narrows and hardens, then spreads and softens, yet it never dissolves. In royal pyramid chambers, he speaks to kings as a craftsman who knows a law. In Middle Kingdom coffins, he gathers names into a circle of linen and resin. In New Kingdom papyri, he joins Osiris at the balance and gives the court a steady hand. In the late period, he receives the thanks of crowds in the dog catacombs at Saqqara, and in the Greco-Roman world, he gains a civic face as Hermanubis, which can walk comfortably in streets named in Greek. The functions do not contradict, they layer, and each layer responds to a door that needs watching. The persistence of priestly costume proves the same point. In tomb scenes at Thebes, a human in a jackal mask bends over a bier, and the gesture makes the god tangible without making him small. The mask is not a theater trick. It is a tool that lets the living lend a face to a power tied to place. In workshops where such masks survive in museums, black varnish still holds a sheen, and the eye sockets still hold white paint that once looked out across bandages. When a modern conservator places such a mask under a light, The surface shows scratches from use, which is the quiet proof of a guardian's hand at work. The small amulets that resemble a jackal curled on a base show an even more private trust. A person who cannot commission painted walls can still own a token that carries a gaze, and can still speak the old names in a low voice. In fields where the Nile's flood once left silt in perfect layers, farmers still plow up such amulets and sell them to dealers who pass them to museums. In display cases from Cairo to Chicago, rows of blue faience jackals lie with their tails forward, and a label mentions Anubis without needing to define him. The shape has done the defining for 3,000 years. Scholars argue over details, as they should. They debate whether Wepwawet and Anubis traded titles at Abydos, and whether specific priestly offices changed functions under the Persians. They sort inscriptions at the Anubiaeon into date groups, and test resins from embalming rooms for botanical sources. They publish Greek inscriptions to Hermanubis from Oxyrhynchus and from Rome, and write essays on Plutarch's vocabulary. Beneath these useful quarrels, a patient reality holds, which is that the western door keeps needing a keeper. Night falls on the ridge west of Memphis, and the same path that carried a bier carries the feet of a man walking home. He glances up and sees the shape of a jackal on a high rock, and the sight carries no mystery, only the presence of a known neighbor. In the town below, a family closes a domestic shrine, and the small bronze figure of a jackal-headed god catches a last light, then sinks into shadow. In storage rooms at the temple, masks wait on pegs, and in galleries under the sand, the dog catacombs rest under dust that no longer moves. Inside a tomb at Saqqara, the air is still, and the resin smell has thinned until it is only a trace. The coffin lies in a niche. The canopic chest sits against a painted scene, and the heart scarab, with its tight lines from chapter 30b, rests against linen that still holds a weave. On the wall, Anubis bends over a lion bed, and beyond, in a separate panel, a balance holds steady under the feather of Ma'at. The god has not moved between rooms. The rooms have opened into each other, and the threshold, which once needed a guard against jackals and men, now needs a guard for a name. In a museum case in Cairo, the Anubis shrine from Tutankhamun glows beneath glass, and children press fingerprints against the pane as if to touch the black snout. In London, the papyrus of Hunnifer spreads across a long mount, and the jackal's hand reaches for the balance with undiminished care. In Rome, a marble Hermanubis stands at ease beside statues of Mercury and Isis, and a label explains the fusion in polite sentences. The objects are still, the eyes that pass before them are countless, and in the silence between a viewer and a figure, an old craft breathes. The figure endures because thresholds are the hardest places to hold. A body needs guarding from time, a name needs guarding from forgetfulness, a judgment needs guarding from anger and from despair. Anubis was born on a ridge where jackals watched the edge of town, and grew into a law that kept hands clean while they touched a face. He learned the weight of resin and salt before he learned the weight of words, and so, when the balance hangs over a heart, his touch is calm. On a mountain above Giza, the wind lifts dust from a path, and the outline of a jackal cuts the dusk. Below, doors close in chapels where offerings cool, and within, in the dark where linen holds its shape, the scale waits for the breath of a name, then settles into the measure that makes a person whole.